Hello, I'm Joseph Barber and this is a brief history of Dungeons & Dragons. The beginnings of D&D lie with miniature wargames. The first such game was published in 1780. These were initially used as a training technique to teach noblemen who were aiming to become military officers. The games were heavily inspired by chess, but with more complicated mechanics including terrain, artillery, and eventually logistics. The first recorded use of dice in such games was in 1806. These games used square blocks or other abstract objects to represent platoons or squadrons of units. However, in 1881 Robert Louis Stevenson became the first documented person to use toy soldiers in such games. His game was never published, but according to his stepson, the rules were very realistic. H. G. Wells published the game Little Wars in 1913, which is often thought of as the first published modern miniature wargame, although it had very simplified rules compared to earlier attempts. In 1955, Jack Scribby began to make inexpensive metal models that became the basis for wargaming today. In addition, he began the first wargaming convention, as well as published his own monthly magazine. The scene continued to grow, though it never reached mainstream acceptance. There were larger and larger conventions, however, and in 1968, the first Gen Con was hosted, an annual event that continues to this day. That was the event that sparked Gary Gygax's interest in the genre. From those roots came Chainmail, a medieval-themed take on the genre. Gygax and Jeff Purin published the first edition in 1971. It became the publisher's biggest game, selling 100 copies a month. A short while after, a fantasy supplement was released, drawing heavily from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, including wizards, hobbits, and elves. Soon after, Dave Wesley and Dave Arneson started playing a variation of Chainmail, where each player controlled an individual unit. Arneson began to add more detailed elements, including character classes, levels, and armor class, forming the foundations of Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax had previously worked with Arneson on another project, so the two quickly began to develop the new fantasy game. They formed a new company called TSR, and it published D&D as a collection of 3 books in 1974. It sold about 1,000 copies in the first year, which was hugely above expectations. The most unique feature of the game was the concept of a referee, or dungeon master, to control the whole world, and the other players only use a single character to interact with it in new and interesting ways. Within a few years, the game had exploded in popularity, and dozens of imitators had released to varying degrees of success. Despite the new competitors, Dungeons & Dragons still remained the premier brand. This was in part due to a two-pronged approach to additional development. There were effectively 2 versions of the game, the basic and the advanced. The next iteration in both were released in 1977. The base game composed of simpler and more free-form rules. They were less complex, and the initial book only allowed for levels 1 to 3, with later expansions expanding the level range. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, on the other hand, offered rules for almost every aspect of the game, and was much heavier on charts and tables, allowing all levels of play right out of the gate. The next edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1989, and this is what is commonly referred to as Second Edition. One major change was the shift away from exclusively token-esque worlds, introducing official settings that were inspired by horror films or sci-fi. In an effort to build public support, many of the more questionable elements from earlier editions were removed, including references to demons and devils, as well as the ability to play evil characters. TSR unfortunately had several unsuccessful business ventures, and were purchased by Wizards of the Coast in 1997, a company most famous for producing Magic the Gathering. 3 years later, they released Dungeons & Dragons 3.0. In addition to creating a new edition, they opted to create a tool for developers to use, the Open Gaming License. This allowed for a number of games based on the D20 system to be released, including Star Wars and Mutants and Masterminds, a superhero RPG. This also meant that all the rules were released freely online in a convenient form, something which allowed for a huge boost in popularity. In 2003, an update was released, fittingly called 3.5. It was aimed at rebalancing some of the weaker options and simplifying some of the more complex rules like grappling. This featured a large number of expansions, totaling around 50 first-party books. Development on a 4th edition began in 2005, and it was released 3 years later. This again aimed for a more streamlined approach, as well as allowing for more interesting options for melee characters. All classes now had sets of power divided into at will, per encounter, and per day. This led to mixed feedback, as some felt everything was homogenized, while others enjoyed the more tactical feel to combat, which was now required to be played on a grid, in some ways harkening back to the game's roots. Due to the blowback, another company, Paizo, began development on their own sequel to 3rd edition. It was called Pathfinder and released in 2009. It attempted to fix some of the problems that were perceived in 3rd, such as the overwhelming power of spellcasters and the numbers creep that occurred at high levels. The game is still popular, and a 2nd edition is being developed to be released later this year. With the next edition of the game, Wizards sought more public feedback than ever before, releasing a series of public betas starting in 2012 and continuing through the next few years. The final game was released in late 2014. It sought to be a mix between the freedom of third while still keeping the engaging tactical combat from fourth. Part of this was doing away with small numerical modifiers, instead introducing the concept of advantage, wherein if someone had a bonus, they would be able to roll twice and take the best result. This change was very well received. Fifth continues to see solid sales and continued support, is released yearly, with no clear signs of stopping. And that is a brief history of Dungeons & Dragons. I hope you found it informative. Have a lovely day.